Donald Trump stood before cheering crowds and promised a future where America would never again depend on anyone else for energy. Energy dominance, he called it. Oil, gas, coal, renewables. He claimed America had it all and the world would have to bow to U.S. power. But today, that illusion has shattered because America's closest neighbor, Canada, just made a move that pulled the plug on Trump's promises, a $40 billion cut in oil exports to the United States. Think about that for a moment. $40 billion worth of crude oil gone. Refineries in the Midwest scrambling for supply. Gasoline prices climbing. Industries from airlines to farmers suddenly facing skyrocketing costs. And the irony couldn't be sharper. Trump boasted that America was energy independent, that no foreign country could ever hold it hostage. Yet here we are, watching as Canada, polite, quiet Canada, flips the switch and exposes America's hidden weakness. This isn't just about oil, this is about power. For decades, Washington dismissed Ottawa as a junior partner, a reliable supplier that would never dare to challenge U.S. dominance. But now, that assumption has backfired. Because while Trump was busy flexing his America First rhetoric, Canada was quietly positioning itself as the one country America can't live without. And make no mistake, this isn't some minor inconvenience. This is a crisis. Because without Canadian crude, America's so-called energy independence collapses overnight. So the question is, how did the U.S., under a president who promised strength, end up this vulnerable to its own neighbor? And what does this $40 billion oil shock mean for every American family, every worker, every business that relies on affordable fuel? To answer that, we need to strip away the myth Trump sold and look at the reality. America was never truly independent. It was always dependent on Canada. Donald Trump built his brand on big, bold promises, and none sounded bigger than energy dominance. On the campaign trail and in the White House, he told Americans that under his leadership, the U.S. would never again depend on foreign oil. He painted a picture of overflowing wells, booming pipelines, and a nation free from the energy entanglements that had haunted Washington for decades. The message resonated for farmers struggling with fuel bills, for truckers watching diesel prices climb, for families paying to heat their homes. Trump's vow of cheap, independent energy was a lifeline. He made it sound as if America was on the brink of energy self-sufficiency, ready to leave OPEC and foreign suppliers behind forever. But here's the truth he never told. America's so-called independence was built on a neighbor's shoulders. That neighbor was Canada. For decades, Canadian crude has been the quiet backbone of the U.S. energy system. More than any other country, more than Saudi Arabia, Mexico, or Venezuela, Canada has supplied the refineries that keep America running. Every day, millions of barrels of Canadian oil flow across the border through pipelines like Keystone and Enbridge. And without that flow, U.S. refineries, especially in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, would grind to a halt. In fact, experts estimate that nearly half of the crude processed in some U.S. refineries isn't American at all. It's Canadian. That means the gas in your car, the jet fuel in the plane you board, even the plastics in your everyday products, all of them rely on Canadian oil. Trump's rhetoric ignored this reality. He boasted about independence, while America's most critical lifeline was foreign. Worse, his policies, tariffs, bullying allies, threatening trade deals, didn't reduce dependence, they deepened it. Because Canada wasn't just a supplier, it was the supplier. And when you depend that heavily on a single partner, you're not independent, you're vulnerable. That's the myth Trump sold, a vision of America as the master of its own energy future. But the truth is harsher. America's energy security was and still is tied directly to its neighbor to the north. And when that neighbor decides to tighten the taps, there's nothing Washington can do to stop the pain. Which brings us to the next part of the story, why Canadian oil matters so much, and why losing it means America's so-called independence collapses overnight. When most Americans think about oil, they picture tankers sailing from the Middle East or political showdowns with OPEC. What almost no one realizes is this: the single most important source of America's oil isn't halfway across the world. It's right next door, in Canada. For decades, Canada has been the quiet lifeline of U.S. energy. It's not a headline-grabbing supplier like Saudi Arabia. It doesn't threaten embargoes like Venezuela once did. It doesn't rattle markets with instability the way the Middle East often does. Instead, Canada has been steady, reliable, and absolutely essential. Here's the scale. Canada provides more crude oil to the United States than Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Russia combined. In fact, nearly 60% of U.S. crude imports come from Canada alone. That's not just a partnership, that's dependence. Without Canadian oil, the entire American refinery system would be thrown into chaos. And that refinery system is built for it. Pipelines like Keystone and Enbridge aren't just optional extras. They're arteries. They move millions of barrels of oil every single day into U.S. refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast. Those refineries are configured specifically to handle Canada's heavy crude. Without it, they don't just slow down. Many of them can't run at all. Think about what that means. The gas in your car, the diesel in America's trucking fleet, the jet fuel that powers airlines, a huge portion of it starts in Canada. Even the plastics in everyday products, the chemicals used in industries, the asphalt on American roads, all of it depends on crude from the north. Trump bragged about energy dominance. But the uncomfortable truth is this: much of America's so-called independence was built on oil that isn't American at all. It was Canadian. And here's the kicker: Canada knows this. Ottawa has long understood that while Washington talks about self-sufficiency, the U.S. energy system is chained to Canadian supply. That dependence gave Canada leverage it rarely used until now. Because the moment Canada decides to restrict or redirect its oil exports, America doesn't just lose a trading partner, it loses the very foundation of its energy security. Prices spike, refineries scramble, industries panic, and ordinary Americans feel the pain at the pump in their heating bills and in the costs of food shipped across the country. The truth is, the gas in your car is more Canadian than you think. Every time you fill up, you're not just paying for American drilling or refining, you're paying for oil that crossed the border from Alberta, Saskatchewan, and other provinces, oil that was never truly America's to begin with. And that's why Canadian oil matters. It's not just one supplier among many, it is the supplier, the lifeline, the quiet backbone of the U.S. economy. And when that lifeline is threatened, the myth of energy independence collapses instantly. Which brings us to the shock itself. The moment Ottawa pulled $40 billion worth of oil out of America's hands and showed just how fragile Trump's promises really were. The day Ottawa made its move, there were no fireworks, no angry speeches, just a quiet announcement that Canada was scaling back crude exports to the United States, a cut worth nearly $40 billion. At first, Washington tried to downplay it. A temporary adjustment, officials said. Nothing to worry about. But the reality was brutal. Within weeks, U.S. refineries in the Midwest began scrambling to secure alternative supply. Tanker orders spiked, costs soared, and oil traders sounded the alarm. This wasn't a minor hiccup. This was an energy shock. Why? Because U.S. refineries aren't built to easily replace Canadian crude. The heavy, sour oil that flows through Keystone and Enbridge pipelines is a specific grade, one America's refinery infrastructure is designed to process. Replacing it isn't as simple as calling Saudi Arabia or pumping more from Texas. You can't re-engineer entire refineries overnight. The immediate fallout hit hard. Gasoline prices started climbing, especially in states most reliant on Canadian imports: the Midwest, the Rust Belt, and parts of the Gulf Coast. Trucking companies saw diesel costs spike, pushing up the price of moving goods. Airlines warned of rising jet fuel bills. Even the cost of farming surged, with tractors and combines burning through expensive fuel at a time when farmers could least afford it. And then there was the financial hit. $40 billion in lost Canadian crude wasn't just a supply disruption, it was a hole in America's energy foundation. Investors panicked, industries froze spending plans, and ordinary households braced for higher bills. The irony couldn't have been more painful. Trump built his legacy on bullying allies like Canada. He slapped tariffs on their steel and aluminum. He mocked their leaders. He threatened to rip up trade agreements unless Ottawa bent to his will. He treated Canada as if it would never push back. But now Canada had found its pressure point. By cutting off oil, the one thing America can't replace quickly, Ottawa proved it had leverage after all. And it didn't need to shout to make its point. It just needed to turn down the tap. For Trump, it was humiliation. His promise of energy dominance collapsed overnight. The United States, which was supposed to be independent, was suddenly exposed as dependent, painfully, dangerously dependent on the very neighbor he had spent years insulting. And this was just the beginning, because if $40 billion could be cut once, it could be cut again. And every time Canada flexes that muscle, America's energy security and Trump's reputation takes another devastating hit. Which brings us to the bigger picture, how Trump's policies backfired so badly that instead of protecting America, they handed Canada the power to bring U.S. energy to its knees. Donald Trump loved to say that tariffs were his ultimate weapon. Trade wars are easy to win, he boasted. In his mind, slapping duties on steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos would force Canada to cave, to beg Washington for relief. But Canada didn't cave. It calculated. It waited. And then it struck where the U.S. was weakest, energy. Here's the backfire. Trump's America First rhetoric alienated America's closest allies. He treated Canada not as a partner, but as a punching bag, piling on tariffs and mocking its leaders in public. Each insult, each tariff, pushed Ottawa closer to using the one card it had, oil. And when that card was played, the illusion shattered. America's so-called energy dominance evaporated in an instant. Think about the irony. Trump spent years promising that America would never again be vulnerable to foreign suppliers. Yet, by alienating Canada, he created the exact vulnerability he claimed to eliminate. He pushed Ottawa into a position where restricting exports wasn't just possible. It was logical. Even worse, Trump's policies made the U.S. more dependent, not less. Domestic production rose, yes, but so did reliance on Canadian crude. Instead of diversifying, America doubled down on a single lifeline. Trump's tariffs squeezed allies like Canada and Mexico, but they didn't fix America's structural weaknesses. They exposed them. And Canada wasn't alone in noticing. Around the world, America's rivals, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, watched as Trump undermined his own alliances. They saw a superpower willing to alienate friends for the sake of cheap applause. They saw Canada, once dismissed as a junior partner, suddenly hold the power to shake U.S. energy markets with a single policy shift. This is the textbook definition of a backfire. A policy designed to make America stronger leaves it weaker. A strategy meant to bully allies into submission instead hands them leverage. And a president who claimed to secure independence ends up delivering dependence. For ordinary Americans, the result is simple: higher prices, fewer jobs, more instability. For Trump, the result is devastating. The myth of America First lies in ruins, replaced by the reality that even America's closest neighbor can bring it to its knees. Which brings us to the next most painful part of this story, the economic fallout at home. How rising gas bills, farm costs, and airline fuel prices will leave every American family paying for Trump's failure. The shockwaves from Canada's $40 billion oil cut don't just hit Wall Street, they slam directly into American households. Suddenly, filling up your gas tank costs more than ever. Families who were already struggling with inflation now face another blow. Higher prices at the pump, higher heating bills in the winter, higher electricity costs across the board, and it doesn't stop there. When oil goes up, everything goes up. Airlines raise ticket prices as jet fuel costs skyrocket. Trucking companies pass their higher fuel bills onto grocery chains, and those costs trickle down to supermarket shelves. A gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, even your Amazon delivery, all of it becomes more expensive because the trucks that carry them run on fuel. For farmers, the pain is even worse. Tractors, fertilizers, irrigation systems all depend on energy. With oil prices spiking, production costs soar, and yet these same farmers are already drowning under collapsing crop prices from Trump's failed trade wars. Now, they're hit again, this time by an energy shock created by America's dependence on Canadian crude. And while ordinary Americans are forced to pay more just to live their lives, Washington scrambles with a predictable response. Subsidies. Billions of taxpayer dollars get thrown around in a desperate attempt to paper over the crisis. But subsidies can't replace trust. They can't undo the reality that Trump's policies turned energy independence into energy vulnerability. Because here's the bitter truth. This isn't just an oil issue, it's a national crisis that touches every corner of the economy. The car you drive, the flight you book, the groceries you buy, all suddenly chained to a decision made not in Washington, but in Ottawa. When Canada cut $40 billion in oil exports to the United States, that crude didn't vanish into thin air. It found new homes, and those new buyers are the true winners of Trump's failed strategy. Asia was first in line. Tankers that once sailed south across the border now steam west across the Pacific. China, desperate to diversify its energy supply, eagerly signs long-term contracts with Canadian producers. For Beijing, this is a double win: reliable access to Canadian oil and one more nail in America's claim to energy dominance. Europe, too, steps in. With the ongoing pressure to reduce reliance on Russian fuel, Canada's barrels become gold in European markets. From Germany to France, policymakers welcome Canada as a stable supplier, strengthening their own energy security while weakening America's bargaining power. And then there are the rivals: Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Brazil. With America scrambling to fill its energy gap, these producers gain leverage, dictating terms and prices on the global market. Every dollar more Americans pay at the pump becomes a dollar of profit for America's competitors. Here's the underdog twist. The neighbor Washington, long dismissed as just a polite partner, is suddenly the kingmaker. Canada, not America, decides where the oil flows. And that shift isn't temporary. It's a rebalancing of power in the global energy game. The $40 billion oil cut is more than a trade dispute. It's a revelation. For decades, America boasted of energy dominance, of being untouchable, of never needing anyone. Trump amplified that myth, turning it into a slogan. But this crisis tears the mask off. Because here's the truth: America's energy independence was never independence at all. It was a fragile web of cross-border pipelines, foreign contracts, and fragile alliances. And when one ally, not an enemy, but Canada, decides to close the valve, the entire system starts to shake. That symbolism matters. It tells the world that the United States, the so-called energy superpower, can't even guarantee its own fuel supply without help from its neighbors. It shows that America first was really America dependent. And it has ripple effects far beyond the oil fields. Allies who once trusted Washington's promises now see weakness. Rivals who feared U.S. dominance now see opportunity. Every barrel not flowing south is a message. America's grip on power is loosening. And the bitter irony? Trump's very policies, his tariffs, his bullying, his obsession with winning, are what pushed Canada into this moment of leverage. Instead of cementing U.S. power, he exposed its vulnerability. At the heart of this oil shock is one undeniable fact. Donald Trump caused it. His arrogance, his reckless tariffs, his refusal to treat allies with respect, all of it set the stage. He bragged about energy dominance, but he never built the infrastructure or trust to back it up. Instead, he bullied Canada, mocked global partners, and gambled America's future on short-term applause lines. Now the result is clear. Trump didn't secure America's energy. He sabotaged it. He turned a trusted neighbor into a power broker and left American families paying the price. V. Trump promised to fill America's tanks. Instead, he left the pump dry and handed the keys to Canada. Canada's $40 billion oil cut has shattered the illusion of America's energy dominance. Gas prices spike, industries scramble, rivals celebrate, all while America is forced to admit a truth it tried to ignore. It cannot fuel its future alone. And the man who promised to make it stronger, Donald Trump, left it weaker, more dependent, and more vulnerable than ever. Trump said America would never bow to foreign energy again. Instead, he made the U.S. bow to its closest neighbor. And if America can't even secure oil from Canada, what happens when the next crisis comes for lithium, cobalt, or food?